Hi everyone, this is the first of two videos that will be covering the construction and painting of this hoverbike. I set myself the challenge of making something purely out of the parts gathered from one single object. So in this instance, I chose a mouse and I'm allowed to use glue and little bits of filler if there are big gaps. But other than that, everything involved in this build is going to come from what I can find in the mouse. Okay, so the first thing to do is to open the box and see what we've got. The whole point of this is to use just the materials that were given. So I'm going to take all the parts of the mouse, going to completely take that apart, but also the box is up for grabs and any packaging that we can also find when we open it up. I don't particularly want to use too much of the box. Once that's all folded out, that'll be one big piece of cardboard. The emphasis is really on using all the little bits and bobs we can find within the mouse itself. So we've got a few little other bits, some instructions, and we've got a little plastic bag that the mouse comes in. So we're not going to discard that. That plastic will be good for if we, create any fabric covers or something like that. Even this little twist tie that we've got around the cable, we'll be using that as well. We'll try and just keep as much as possible. That's the important thing when you're doing a project like this. Keep everything. You never know what you're going to use. So we're going to dive straight in with a screwdriver, and we're just going to take out the one screw connecting the two halves of the mouse together so that we can crack on into the inside and start taking this all apart. Remember to keep the screw at the end, little piece like that, you never know. So open it up, you can see we've got a nice bit of circuitry. We've got the scroller wheel. And of course we've got the cable as well, the USB cable. There's a lot of material there that we might be able to use. This screw's proving a little bit tricky to get out, so just popping that out with the screwdriver. Useful when you're doing this bit to have a little container over to one side so all these little bits and bobs don't get lost. So the mouse wheel comes out really easily there. We've got a nice piece that we can use. And we've got loads of little bits on the circuit board. We've got the little plastic cover for the LED. That's kind of a nice, interesting moulding. And straight away, I noticed that the two buttons on the mouse are actually just clipped in at the back there. So I'm going to try and push those apart and get that all off in one piece. A little bit of a struggle. It's quite a tight fitting. But there we go. You see we've got another quite interesting piece there. And what's also really lovely is all the little mouldings and bits of plastic that are coming off from the inside of those two big panels there. You can just see it on the bottom one there, some little interesting shapes. So there's everything we've got. And let's get started trying to figure out what we're going to build. So we've got these three big moulded pieces here. And I think that's pretty logical to start off with one of these to form the main body of our build. I really like this piece. You can see all those little bits of plastic coming out from the inside there. We could cut those off, use those as extra details. What grabbed my eye with this one was the back. I can kind of see like that being cut off in half and then making a piece out of that. So you see I'm going in straight with the saw. My left hand's putting a lot of pressure down there to stop the piece moving around too much. I'm just going to go in and cut that piece off. I don't know really what shape it's going to make or if it's going to work, but just dive straight in and give everything a go. So just going to saw that off to get that piece nice and whole. I've sawed that off and I've also split it in two. And first thing I notice is that there's those two bits of plastic in the center there, stopping me from aligning the two. So I'm just going to go in with my clippers here, taking those off. I'm going to save these They've got a little bit of an interesting mold to them, so I'm going to put those to one side in my bits box. And once those are off, I should now be able to align them together. Now the edges are curved, obviously because of how these buttons were fitted to the mouse, so they don't actually fit flush. So as long as I've got a few contact points there, I should be fine. But straight away, I can kind of see like the back of a moped, kind of a little bit of a retro look with the wheel arch on the bottom piece there. So just by getting these two pieces, starting to think of like a motorbike, something like that. I haven't got any wheels. That's just evident from the pieces that I've got. So maybe we could do something like a hoverbike. I'm just trimming off the pieces at the back here to give it a better fit, just to give it a bit more contact. To glue these two bits together, even though I've trimmed off quite a lot of plastic, it's so essential that I sand the edges. With plastic like this, even if you use super glue, the chances are that they'll just snap off after a certain amount of time. By sanding the edges, you're going to create a really rough surface that the glue can kind of soak into, and it'll just give it much more grip. So anything like this, though it's common across all materials in model making, make sure you sand the surface to give it a really good join. You see also that I'm aligning the two pieces. I'm practicing putting them both together. Anything like this, half of it's muscle memory. This is what we call a dry fit. You want to put the pieces together without glue to make sure that everything fits together. And when it comes to gluing, you'll actually be able to position them much more effectively. And then taking two of the other buttons here and cutting them in half. They've got a similar shape. You've seen the hole at the top there to the arches on the two pieces I've just cut out. So I'm just using a saw to score two pieces. And then once I've done that, I can break them in two, and we can see if I can get another section for this vehicle. Again, taking some sponge sanding sticks to smooth those off. No idea if it'll be seen, so we sand it just to be on the safe side. These two pieces go together a little bit better. Curved again, and there's a huge gap in between the two, but they will glue with a bit of patience. And I really love the shape. This is kind of where I'm starting to see a hoverbike really take shape. I love the aerodynamic shape to this. You can kind of see like a control panel space at the back. So yeah, this is looking promising. So now it's time to actually start building. So I'm going to take some super glue and run it along the edges that I've sanded. Always make sure you sand the edges before you glue to give it a much better bond. I'm using Loctite because if in doubt, it's pretty much a fail-safe option. And again, because I've done the dry fit so many times, when it actually comes to gluing it, everything goes pretty smoothly. Important when you've got gaps between two pieces, not to press too tightly. You might end up snapping the two pieces off of each other. So just kind of little pinch, and that's all you need. Even with super glue, if you mess up the alignment first time, you might actually find the glue doesn't set. It becomes quite gloopy, and it takes a long time to go off. So really just be patient. Don't be too forceful. Let it do its thing. So after doing the same thing with the back, I'm now going to take the two pieces and see how we can fit those together. Fairly obvious example is what I've just showing you there. You got a bit of a retro vehicle aesthetic, but just playing around with some of the layouts, maybe it's not a conventional hovercraft, maybe it's actually quite vertical. You see, I'm just playing around. It was almost kind of like a seat there, a bit of a throne. But I think the first one plays out much better, much more conventional. It's going to be easier to detail. There's not too big a gaps. But the first big gap is right there in that front piece where you can kind of see a cockpit forming now. We've got to get that filled in really before we attach that back panel, because it's easier to access it now than it would be with that back panel on. So I'm going to take another big chunk of plastic from the mouse, and we've got all these interesting shapes in this big panel that I've got, and I'm just holding it up to that front piece to see how this might fit in. I can kind of make out maybe a little bit of a console or something from the middle section there. So again, just getting my saw to cut that out. So with that piece removed, I'm now going to try and slot that into place. Of course, it doesn't fit straight away, so we'll have to sand down the edges. But I like how the protrusions from the base of that piece give you lots to glue onto, hook into. There's opportunities to put maybe handles or little instruments there. So I'm just sanding down the corners to give it a better fit, and we'll see where it goes. Obviously, at this stage, I'm just trying to look at shape and form and fill some of the big gaps. With the amount of pieces that we've got from this mouse, I don't think there'll be any trouble finding some instruments or details for the cockpit here. And I think this piece does a good job of just filling up the space. After lots of sanding and dry fitting, time to get the glue in. Another bonus of dry fitting is you actually know where to put the glue. So I know exactly what the contact points are for this piece here. Too much glue, just get a cotton bud or a cocktail stick just to soak it up. And then ever so carefully inserting that into the front panel there, ready to go. With that part drying, it's now to go in with some model filler, just to get these two big gaps in both halves covered up. I'm going to use a bit of cardboard to just glue underneath each one to stop the filler going straight through, just to give it a bit more support. And this will also stop it from cracking further down the line. Now, the only other materials I've allowed myself for this build are obviously the glue to hold it all together, and also a bit of filler in case there are any big gaps, as there often are with projects like these. And as long as they conform to the surface. So I'm not going to use the filler to sculpt additional details. It is literally just to fill in the gaps and join the two pieces together. Other than that, it's all completely using the parts that we have. So taking some of the cardboard from the box, just going to pop that underneath to use as a base to apply the filler. The filler's applied quite liberally, and I apply it straight from the tube, and I just use the actual end of the tube to smooth it all off. I'm going to have to do this twice. The first time we apply the filler, when it dries, it's going to dip in the middle. It's going to slightly shrink. Once that's dried, we'll then apply a second layer, and that will be our final coating where it'll all be nice and smooth. So all quite rough at the moment, but it'll all get sanded off nicely at the end. After waiting 2 days for this to dry, and obviously to apply 2 coats, I then go in with 3 grades of sandpaper to get this all buffed up nice and smooth. Make sure there are no marks. This is one of the most tedious parts of pretty much every model build, but it really does make the difference between a mediocre and a professional job, is making sure you get all those scratches and marks sanded out and everything's nice and level. There's no point going to all this trouble of filling in that gap if we then see 2 big seams when we get to our final paint job. So take your time with this, go right through the grades of the sandpaper and get it all nice and smooth. A new day, and after all that prep and sanding, it's time to crack on with the major build. So I'm getting the 2 pieces now and aligning them together. Again, all dry fitting and muscle memory. This is a really important bond here because it's going to be the initial structure, and it's going to have to hold quite well until I can detail it up and add a bit more strength. So again, we're going to sand the edges here. We're going to sand down the points of contact. I'm just using a needle file to do this, to give us as strong a bond as we can. Notice that I won't sand the front piece there, and that's because that will actually be seen, and I don't want to risk scratching that up too much. So we're going to risk it and just sand one of the pieces. I'm keeping everything flat on the cutting mat there, so it gives me a good reference point. And you can see that as I glue them together, I move the whole model side to side, and that's to stop any glue that runs to the bottom gluing it to the cutting mat. So I keep that moving so there's no problems. And once I've done that, it's time to get the bits box out and start playing around. Getting the bits box, the first piece that pops up is this little square panel. I don't know all the technical names, I'm afraid. But it's a nice flat area. It's got a bit of a cushion to it. It's got these interesting side details. So I think that is going to form the base of my seat. When I approach projects like this, I don't worry too much about what bits and pieces are on them. A, because you never really know what you've got until it's in front of you. And B, 95% of the time, it's actually happy accidental detail. It's all stuff that in the end really adds to it. So just getting some tweezers there, trying to position it. It's a little bit tricky, but it seems to fit. So we'll go ahead with that. After that's glued in place, I've got the cover for the LED that is really nice. I can see a little bit of a headrest with that angular piece jutting out. And just to make it a little bit more in keeping with the form we've already got, I'm just going to round the edges by sanding them to make it basically this huge backrest. And if I paint the headrest the same colour as the seat that we've just glued in, hopefully that should link the two quite well and it all looks quite natural. Now there is actually letters and sort of like a little barcode almost or something, an identification number etched into the surface of this plastic, but I'm not sanding that out because I quite like little details like that. They add to the character. They show that it's been made from found objects. I don't want to hide that this has been made from a mouse. I just want to I want to show that it has been made from found objects, but look, convincing enough, a nice model piece. Once that was sanded down, I applied a bit of glue and a little bit of glue onto the backrest there and slotted that into place. And this is the piece that really holds everything together. It glues the front and the back, it helps the join right at the base, and now everything's really nice and sturdy. And we can sort of go to town on this now, detailing it as and when we wish. The next bit is to figure out power. So this is firmly a hoverbike at this point. So now I'm trying to think of the engine, and we're going to have lots of empty space at the bottom of this. So let's try and fill that up. So the first thing I grab is the USB cable. Automatically, I can see the USB at the end is kind of like almost like an exhaust or a big jet engine. And it's a nice big chunky piece as well, so it kind of fits the bill. So immediately snap that off. And just going to look at other pieces to try and bulk it out. I really like the tyre that we've got, but I might save that for something else. But the piece that was supporting the tyre, the actual wheel, fits quite nicely onto the end there. You see that shaft matches up quite well to the end of the USB, so it should blend in quite nicely. And it'll just sort of lengthen that to go the whole length of the vehicle. So again, bit of super glue, and we're going to join the two together. Once that's dried, I then flip over the Hoverbike. We've got that nice bit of plastic in the center there, which will form a nice solid base to glue the USB engine on. And just going to pop that on and make sure it aligns right down the center, just so it stands up well. So this is the stage we're up to now. That's all nice and secured. And we can kind of really start to see this take shape. I'm really happy with where this is at now. And now it's time to do one of our favorite bits, where it's tip all the parts onto the table and start detailing this up. Now we've got all the base sorted. So this diode straight away, it's got that little indent at the top where the plastic comes round. So I can see this being kind of like a little dial or a sat nav, some kind of navigation instrument. And with a bit of luck, as I said, none of this is planned. You just go with the flow and trust that everything will work. This little diode, once I actually get it onto the tweezers, fits beautifully into the little slot created by the console piece we cut right at the start. So that's a no-brainer. That's going straight in. It's at this point that I think the seat needed bulking out a little bit more. It looked a little too thin for kind of the bulky vehicle we're going for. So I'm going to cut some more of the little sprues from the big panel on the top of the mouse here. And I'm just going to glue those to the side of the seat to create kind of like a frame, like a roll cage or something like that, just to give it a bit of width and to bulk it out. I mean, you got the front section of this vehicle that's a lot wider than the back. So having a much bulkier seat, I think, works quite well. So just slotting those in, and we'll super glue those in place. This piece kind of jumped out at me. It's a little kind of metal etching that came off the circuit board, and I really liked how it was like a little frame, like a little canopy. So I was playing around with this little halo at the very top of the seat, but that didn't look quite right. But what really jumped out straight away was this wrapping around the diode that we placed at the front and helping to create more of a little console just before the seat. So just putting a little bit of glue on the end there. And you see me just slide that, hook it over the diode. And yeah, we just got a little bit of depth and, a little bit of relief to the cockpit area there, which I really liked. That was one of my favorite details from this. So after doing a lot more detailing in the cockpit, I decided to focus on other parts of the model. So from disassembling more of the circuit board, I got these little red, like plastic clips almost, and they jumped out straight away as little brake lights that I could have either side at the back there. Really fiddly. So I had to actually put a little bit of super glue onto the rest of the circuit board just to dip it into. But actually they glued really well. I was quite surprised actually how easy they went on. And they fitted in really well as the model continued. So I was really happy with those. This next bit added a whole lot of character to the model. So I'm just taking part of the USB cable and slotting that into the side. It actually jams in really well into the back corner there. So it was a nice secure fixing. And it gives this great little, almost like Wacky Races exhaust pipe out the back there. So I'm just trimming the end off that. And we'll get that glued straight away. This is one of the things I'm actually not going to make symmetrical. I do half and half. I like some parts of my model to be symmetrical, but also asymmetry does give it a lot of character and makes it much more interesting to look at, in my opinion. So this is one of the things that I don't mirror on the other side. I had some more detail to the back of the model, but it's this point where the undercarriage is really getting neglected. So I start by adding these little side thrusters that theoretically would keep the vehicle stable. Of course, I'm under no impression that this wouldn't really work in real life. But it's all about giving the impressions, so we're just going to glue those on underneath. And it also helps break that straight horizontal line that the front and back casing sit on. Because of the little bits of metal sticking out, these actually don't fit on straight. However, I quite like that in the end. It just made it a little bit more interesting. Next up was a bracket to hold the midsection of the engine, which I use with the remainder of the USB cable. I keep all those little coloured wires to one side. They should be a nice detail later on. But I'm just cutting this up and I'm going to hopefully glue this to the front casing and the rest of the engine. So the whole engine section is glued now at either end. And it just about fits, a little bit of tweaking, but that's going to go up into the front. And it also curves up into the front casing as well. So it actually looks like it's coming from an engine or some equipment hidden under the hood there. This next bit was quite fun, sort of getting these coloured wires and making the base look a little bit more mechanical, giving it a little bit more life. It's just a bit boring at the moment, and these wires, I think, will make it look a little bit more like a working engine, something that's really been bashed together, something quite loose and almost falling apart. So I find this little nook to securely glue the wires, and then once they're glued in, we'll kind of figure out where they're going to go, wrap them around the engine, and just make it look a little bit more mechanical. Whilst I was waiting for the wires to dry securely, I found a great little location for the rubber wheel to go. Even though this is a hover bike, I love how the back wheel kind of adds a really kind of retro vibe to it. Obviously, it makes no sense, but it fits into that slot there, so it'll hide any roughness there. And I think it just makes it look a little quirkier. It's a little funny, and we just need to give it a bit of strength. So I'm just going to slot a piece of cardboard into it, and I'm going to wrap that cardboard in some of the plastic bag that the mouse came in to make it almost look like it's a cover insert or something like that. And it'll give me something a bit more to actually glue onto. Whilst the back wheel's drying, you can see it there just with a little bit of plastic wrapped around the cardboard. I'm now going to start rearranging the wires. What I saw after a little bit was that the impressions in the engine that I've glued on actually formed great little slots to hook the wire into and hold it in place. So this made it much easier to start wrapping those wires round and making it seem as though everything was actually connected and controlled by something. So those slotted in quite nicely. And some of the wires dipped down, some of them wrapped around the engine. I didn't want it to be too wacky, but it added just about enough interest, I think, to really complete this section. After the wires were wrapped around, it became really obvious that the model was quite unstable when you tried to sit it down on a level surface. So I'm just adding this little cover at the back of the engine here to give it a little bit more stability. And it also hides the USB logo at the back, so it's kind of a dual purpose thing. And then with the last wire, I can wrap that round, and we've kind of got this base part finished. Several details later, the final part to go on are these little brass etchings that I actually folded in half, and they formed really lovely little footrests with a nice bit of detail on them that I glued either side of the cockpit there. And I think they really kind of finished the whole model off. You can see that I also added a stabilizer on the left-hand side. Even with the extra part I'd glued to the base of the engine, the model was still tipping over. So this just helped really stabilize the whole thing one final time. And of course, it makes complete sense with the type of build that we're going for. So I'm just gluing on those final footrests, and then we can call this one done. Note how the back wheel has been left off. That will actually be kept separate for ease of painting in the next video. So there we have it. There's the final build. I've temporarily attached the back wheel so you can see how it all looks. I'm really happy with how this turned out. I think it's got the right amount of detail. I've got a lot of pieces left over, but they can always go towards another project. But all in all, I'm really happy with this build. And the next stage now is to get it primed and get it painted.